In this documentary, we illustrate some of the major beliefs and practices of traditional Islam from the life and teachings of Muhammad. The biographical details presented here are taken directly from original Islamic sources and can be found in numerous scholarly works. Most of the artwork used in this program was produced by medieval and early modern Muslim artists, whose works were commissioned and approved by Islamic rulers and authorities.
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله.
You have indeed in the Messenger of Allah a beautiful pattern of conduct for anyone whose hope is in Allah and the final day and who engages much in the praise of Allah.
Numbering over 1.6 billion adherents, Islam is the second largest religion in the world. Over the past 1,400 years, few religious and political leaders have influenced the course of history more than Muhammad, the prophet of Islam.
Traditional Islam teaches that Islam is God's first and final revelation to humanity. Adam was a Muslim. Abraham was a Muslim. Moses was a Muslim. Jesus was a Muslim. Muhammad is God's last prophet, surpassing Jesus and all other prophets.
Muslims may dispute certain interpretations of the Quran, but for the vast majority of Muslims, the example and teachings, the Sunnah, of Muhammad are final. Whatever he did, taught, or allowed should be emulated. Whatever he forbade cannot be permitted. Throughout Muslim history, this Sunnah has been foundational to Islamic law called Sharia. Since there is very little direct information about Muhammad in the Quran, Muslims turn to those traditions, or hadith, which have been accepted and interpreted by the consensus of Islamic scholars. Most of those traditions were passed down orally at first, then collected and recorded generations later.
Everything we know about Muhammad comes from Islamic sources. There are no first-hand sources for his life or teachings that have come down to us from non-Muslims. The earliest biography dates about a century after Muhammad, but has been lost. The earliest extant biography, by Ibn Ishaq, was written about 150 years after Muhammad's death, which occurred in 632 AD. But it likely incorporated older material. The massive collections of traditions known in Sunni Islam as the 6 correct books were published about 250 years after Muhammad's death. This historical distance casts some doubt on the reliability of these accounts, which, as evidence shows, were sometimes embellished or distorted for political or religious reasons.
Muslim scholars have carefully catalogued the teachings and examples set forth by Muhammad, including minutiae such as his personal hygiene, clothing, sex life, diet, and personal habits. Muslim groups, such as the Wahhabis, originating in Saudi Arabia, and the Salafists, or traditionalists, study every aspect of Muhammad's life in order to imitate his example. Both of these movements have extensive followings throughout the world and have sometimes served as incubators for terrorism.
Many Muslims, however, have never studied Muhammad's life in detail. They may be familiar only with his virtues while remaining ignorant of his imperfections. Some Muslims, especially here in the U.S., believe that the strict imitation of his life is not essential to being a faithful Muslim.
September 11th, 2001. The largest terrorist attack in history, claiming nearly 3,000 American lives. Since then, terrorists have committed tens of thousands of violent acts in the name of Islam. Yet many Muslims claim that Islam is a religion of peace. How can these opposing views of Islam be reconciled? The answer lies in the character of Muhammad himself.
In some ways, Muhammad was a tragic figure. Sincerely believing that Allah is the only true God, his burning desire was to lead his people out of idolatry into monotheism. His message was delivered peacefully and non-violently at the start, but ended in violence, military conquests, threats, and assassinations.
Born in Mecca about 570 AD, few details are known about Muhammad's early life. At the age of 25, he married his wealthy but older distant cousin Khadijah. With her moral and financial support, he began to pursue a contemplative life in his search for truth. He periodically withdrew to secluded spots around Mecca in order to meditate. 15 years later, he is said to have received his first revelation from the angel Gabriel. Following a span of 2 to 3 years, at the age of 43, Muhammad began his preaching ministry against idolatry in Mecca. His tolerant tone is reflected in some of the early verses of the Quran, such as, "Unto you your religion, and unto me my religion." But these verses were later abrogated, that is, superseded, by new revelations, some advocating the use of force. 2 years after he began preaching in Mecca, Muhammad and his followers were persecuted. The small band of Muslims were economically cut off from Mecca and brought to the brink of starvation. Several years later, at the age of 53, they left Mecca to relocate at Medina. Known as the Hijra, or migration, this event became a turning point in Islamic history and marks year 1 of the Islamic calendar.
We see a major change in the temperament of Islam and its founder after the Hijra to Medina. Muhammad becomes a political and military leader. Verses in the Quran take on a more authoritative tone as they shift from theology to legislation. Obedience is demanded under threat of punishment. Muhammad begins to avenge the mistreatment he suffered from the Meccans by launching a series of unprovoked caravan raids against them, which culminate in the Battle of Badr. Though vastly outnumbered, the Muslims defeated the Meccans. Muhammad and his followers viewed this as a certain sign of divine favor. Muhammad also assassinated some of his enemies, irrespective of age or sex. According to the earliest biography, a female poet who mocked him, Asma bint Marwan, was murdered in her bed as she slept with her 5 children. He never carried out these assassinations himself. He would simply say to his men, "Who will rid me of this person?" And there were always volunteers who stepped forward.
Barbaric executions and punishments were also carried out by Muhammad's approval or direct order. These included amputations, crucifixion, gouging out eyes, and even tearing an elderly woman in two. Regretting, perhaps, the cruelty of some of his actions, Muhammad limited future punishments to amputation and crucifixion. These punishments are prescribed in the Quran and under Sharia against highway robbery and those who are accused of making mischief in the land. Torture was employed in some cases. Muhammad had a Jewish leader, Kanana, tortured to reveal the location of the city's treasury. After beheading him, Muhammad married his widow.
Muhammad was, in this regard, a man of his times. His use of force was in keeping with the practices of his culture. He brought reform to many aspects of Arab life, but the use of violence to advance a religious cause is what divides him from religious figures like Jesus, Buddha, and Gandhi.
Muhammad's use of violence continues to influence clerics, groups, and nations who adhere closely to traditional Islamic beliefs. Despite objections from more progressive Muslim scholars, especially in the West, Muhammad's example is often cited as the justification for perpetuating violence in the cause of Islam. Notwithstanding his use of violence, Muhammad also excelled in personal acts of kindness that earned the admiration of both his friends and enemies, and attracted numerous converts. This aspect of his character is often overshadowed by his military conquests and personal vendettas. Nevertheless, Muhammad was loved and esteemed as much as he was feared. For this reason, Muslims still look to him as a model of virtue.
This is a topic which is treated at great length by Muslim apologists, but rarely mentioned by many of his critics. The issue has become highly polarized, so that Muhammad must either be all good or all bad. Revisionist histories of Muhammad recast him as a sort of Jesus figure. Though this approach is especially attractive to Westerners, it does not gain much traction with scholars who have studied his life in detail. Yet, from some of the stories of Muhammad that have come down to us, it's difficult not to admire his personal concern and kindness for the welfare of those who followed him.
According to one story, at the age of 35, prior to the commencement of his ministry, Muhammad resolved a sharp and potentially violent disagreement between Arab tribes regarding the placement of the sacred black stone during the reconstruction of the Meccan temple, the Kaaba. Each tribe demanded the honor of restoring the stone to its place. Muhammad satisfied the contending parties by placing the stone on a cloth. This enabled a leader from each tribe to share in the honor of raising it by taking hold of the edge of the cloth. That same year, Muhammad adopted and freed Zaid, his wife's slave boy. This generosity endured throughout his ministry. Muhammad was known to be kind and generous to the poor and the underclass. In many ways, he championed their cause. He also ended the cruel practice of female infanticide, which allowed unwanted infant girls to be buried alive in the desert sands. Soon after Muhammad arrived in Medina, when he was 53, he entered into a treaty with the Jews and Arab pagans there in order to secure the safety of the Muslim community. Known as the Charter or Constitution of Medina, this social contract guaranteed, if only for a brief time, the same political and cultural rights to both Muslims and non-Muslims, and also granted religious freedom to all. After conquering his enemies at Mecca at the age of 60, Muhammad granted a general amnesty and even forgave some of his personal enemies. Amnesty was also granted to other tribes once their fealty was secured. By putting an end to tribal rivalry and blood feuds, he united all Arabs into one community and nation, bonded by faith rather than blood. In at least one instance, Muhammad reacted against the use of excessive force after one of his generals slaughtered the men of the Jazama tribe. Muhammad decried the massacre and compensated the tribe's widows and orphans. After establishing his power in Arabia, Muhammad set up a tax collection system in which part of the tax money, called the zakat, was designated as alms for poor Muslims. The zakat is still collected today.
In his farewell sermon at the age of 62, Muhammad encouraged equality and the kind treatment of wives and slaves. He modeled this himself by helping them with their daily work. There was no task too menial in his view. He chose to live in relatively humble circumstances, not in a palace or as a king. And shortly before his death, still mindful of the less fortunate, Muhammad ordered that 6 gold coins, which he kept in his apartment, be given to the poor.
Jihad, which means to struggle, is part of the essence of Islam. Muhammad viewed Islam as a spiritual struggle against sin, a political and physical struggle against those who hinder or persecute Muslims, and a military struggle against tribes and nations who refuse to submit to Islam. The Islamic doctrine of war evolved as Muhammad's struggle against the Arabs, Jews, and Christians changed from a spiritual and prophetic conflict to a military conflict. At the age of 53, shortly after the Hijrah to Medina, Muhammad conducted numerous raids against Meccan caravans. These were seen as divine retribution against the Meccans for the persecution of Muslims, the confiscation of their properties after they left Mecca, and the rejection of God's prophet.
The religious justification for war really took place with the 7th raid, which was fought during a holy month when fighting was forbidden. According to the Quran, even though fighting during the sacred months is evil, Allah ultimately encouraged the Muslims to fight a holy war since the cause against their persecutors was just. Unbelief and persecution, according to the Quran, are worse than killing.
7 years later, at the age of 60, Muhammad assumed control of Mecca. Weakened and divided in their loyalties, the Meccans were no match for Muhammad's 10,000-man army. Muhammad cleansed the temple there, the Kaaba, by destroying its 360 idols along with the pictures of Abraham and the angels. The Meccans were compelled by this overwhelming show of force to pledge their allegiance to Muhammad and Islam. Finally, shortly after Muhammad's death at the age of 62, Muslim forces executed his final order and utterly destroyed and plundered the city of Mu'tah to avenge the murder of a Muslim envoy. In all, Muhammad participated in 27 to 29 battles during his lifetime. These battles were chronicled by early Muslim historians.
Muhammad rarely fought in these battles himself. Nevertheless, he was a shrewd military and political strategist. Many of the battles were not conducted for self-defense, as some apologists for Islam contend. Rather, war became an instrument for propagating Islam among the Arab idolaters who refused Muhammad's invitation to convert. Subsequent generations followed a very similar approach, resulting in the expansion of the Islamic Empire stretching all the way from Europe to India.
The legacy of jihad continues today across the world through well-funded Islamic militias and terrorist groups, whose ultimate goal, in many cases, is to establish Islamic rule under a caliph, that is, a successor to Muhammad. However, not all Muslim scholars recognize the legitimacy of these groups. Following Muhammad's example, terrorist groups often target Muslim sects which they view as heretical, in an attempt to purify Islam. Non-Muslims are attacked as part of a long-term strategy to intimidate and ultimately subdue Western nations, but also in retaliation for political and military interference by the West in Muslim countries, and in defense of Islam, which they believe is under attack by the West. Attempts by terrorists to justify a consistent policy of targeting unarmed civilians, especially women and children, by appealing to Muhammad's example are rejected by many Muslim scholars. Finally, many Islamic scholars, especially in Muslim countries, continue to promote the doctrine and theology of jihad taught by Muhammad. This is disseminated through commentaries on the Quran, which are translated into different languages, through numerous articles and publications, through mosques scattered throughout the world, and through some prominent Islamic schools and universities. Throughout most of Islamic history, and even today to some degree, the treatment of non-Muslims who live under Islamic rule was patterned after the example set forth by Muhammad. After his conquest of the wealthy Khaybar oasis at age 58, Jews who refused the invitation to Islam could remain in the land only if they accepted Muslim rule and paid an annual tribute or protection tax called the jizya, which in this case amounted to 50% of their harvest. A similar precedent was followed in nearly all Muslim wars against Jews and Christians down through history. About a year after conquering Mecca, where he compelled the idolatrous Meccans to pledge their allegiance to Islam, Muhammad declared that idolatry would no longer be tolerated throughout Arabia. After a 4-month period of grace, those who persist would be killed. Christians and Jews, on the other hand, would be subjugated, by force if necessary, and as before, required to pay the jizya tax. As dhimmis under Islam, their religious, legal, and personal rights would be curtailed.
This ultimatum was laid down in Surah 9, that is chapter 9 of the Quran. In verse 29, he instructs Muslims to fight against those who believe not in Allah, nor in the last day, nor forbid that which has been forbidden by Allah and His Messenger, and to fight against those who acknowledge not the religion of truth, that is Islam, among the people of the Scripture, Jews and Christians, until they pay the jizya, that is the protection tax, with willing submission and feel themselves subdued.
The period of toleration having ended, pagans in 7th century Arabia were forced to accept Islam or die. Down through history, Muhammad's precedent was applied to other polytheists, such as Hindus, though not consistently. In some cases, polytheists were tolerated under Muslim rule, in other cases they were not. Nevertheless, tens of millions of Hindus were likely killed in India during the early Middle Ages under Muslim rule.
People of the book, Christians and Jews, were usually tolerated so long as they paid the jizya and humbled themselves before their Muslim conquerors. Yet Muhammad, shortly before his death, still mindful that both the Christians and the Jews rejected his prophetic claims, cursed them both. According to the Muslim historians Ibn Sa'ad and Ibn Kathir, he said, "The Lord destroy the Jews and the Christians." Traditional Islamic teaching maintains that the destiny of Islam is to rule over the world. At the end of history, when Jesus returns and the Mahdi, that is the Muslim Messiah, appears, all other belief systems will be destroyed and everyone will be forced to submit to the rule of Allah.
Though Muslim countries, with rare exceptions, no longer impose the jizya tax on non-Muslims, the discriminatory treatment and persecution of these groups, especially Christians, still occurs today in parts of the Muslim world. The Jewish tribes of Arabia played a pivotal role in the formation of Islam. The Quran adapts numerous beliefs, stories, laws, and rituals from the first 5 books of the Old Testament, called the Torah or Law, along with rabbinic interpretations and legends found in the Talmud. Muhammad's ongoing relationship with the Jews of his day would become the template for all subsequent history.
Muhammad's mission, as he saw it, was to call the Arabs, Jews, and Christians back to true monotheism. This monotheism, he believed, existed prior to the alleged distortions and misinterpretations later propagated by these groups. Though he had only limited contact with Christians, there were many Jewish tribes living in Arabia at the time. These Jews were willing to carry on business with him and enter into agreements with him in defending against aggressors, but their religious beliefs were strictly off limits. This became the source of a deep and lasting conflict which has persisted to this day.
From the onset of his public ministry at the age of 43, Muhammad sought the endorsement of the Jews as a prophet and the successor to Moses. He believed that his coming was foretold in their scriptures in the 18th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy. The Lord spoke to Moses and said, "I will raise up a prophet from among their countrymen like you, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. It shall come about that whoever will not listen to my words, which he shall speak in my name, I myself will require it of him." Shortly after arriving in Medina 9 years later, Muhammad signed a mutual defense treaty with the Jews. But within a year, he became disillusioned and angered by their rejection of his prophetic claims, and in response, changed the direction of prayer, the Qibla, from Jerusalem to the Kaaba in Mecca. At that point, Islam was transformed from a unifying movement to a distinct Arabian religion in which the Muslims, not the Jews, were regarded as the true spiritual descendants of Abraham, Moses, and the prophets.
Pain of this rejection by the Jews was intensified by reports that they had colluded with his enemies. Since these reports come down to us from Muslim historians, we will probably never hear the other side of the story. Nevertheless, beginning with the siege of the Jewish Kanuka tribe, when Muhammad was 54, his rejection by the Jews was avenged by exiles, battles, murders, and persecutions. In the Quran, the Jews who broke the Sabbath under Moses are those whom Allah has cursed, who have been under his wrath, some of whom were turned into apes and pigs. These verses were cited by Muhammad against the Jews, and they have been quoted frequently ever since, even to the present.
Muhammad gave permission to his followers to kill Jews wherever they encounter them, resulting in the slaying of a Jewish merchant. This state of affairs lasted only a brief time until Muhammad entered into a new treaty with the Jews. But 3 years later, following accusations of betrayal, the Muslim army besieged the disaffected Banu Qurayza tribe. 700 to 900 adult males were beheaded by his permission. 1,000 women and girls were enslaved or sold. At age 58, Muhammad was poisoned by a Jewess who lost her husband, father, uncle, and brother in the Battle of Khaybar. He survived, but the woman was executed. Some believe that the chronic effects of the poison may have hastened Muhammad's death, which occurred about 4 years later. According to a number of reliable hadiths, Muhammad proclaimed that the Day of Judgment will not come about until Muslims fight the Jews. When the Jews hide behind stones and trees, they will say, "O Muslims, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him." After Muhammad died in 632, Jews and Christians were expelled from Arabia by his successor Umar in 641 AD. In the centuries which followed, Jews were allowed to practice their religion elsewhere. Despite their dhimmi status, they were sometimes accorded better treatment under Muslim rule than under the Byzantine and Western Christians. But by the 13th century, the modicum of tolerance which marked the golden age of Islamic civilization began to give way to a rigid, controlling, feudalistic mentality. Many Jews were forced into ghettos, and some Jewish and Christian communities were destroyed.
Conditions deteriorated further in the 19th century with the decline of the Ottoman Empire. Modern anti-Semitism first appeared in the Muslim world during this period. In World War II, the Mufti of Jerusalem allied with Hitler. He was eager to continue Hitler's genocide by exterminating the Jews in Palestine once Hitler was done in Germany. Ironically, today, many Muslims deny the Holocaust ever happened.
Sadly, there is a very deep hatred of Jews throughout much of the Muslim world today. This is directed not only against the nation of Israel, but often extends to Jews everywhere. Jewish communities in Europe have seen a sharp rise in persecution by Muslims there. We see efforts at reconciliation here in America among moderate and westernized Muslims, but these are the exception rather than the rule. The social status and rights of women in Islam is, perhaps, one of the most controversial issues facing Muslims today. There are many voices who claim to speak for Islam, and many interpretations of the Quran, ranging from Western feminism to traditional male domination. But what is the teaching and example of Muhammad, according to the Quran and Islam's authoritative traditions? Between the ages of 25 and 62, Muhammad had 11 wives, 2 acquired as the spoils of war, and 2 concubines. Shia Muslims maintain that Muhammad had 22 wives. Muhammad permitted Muslim men to have only 4 wives. But in paradise, they will have many virgins and slaves. There, Muslim women will have their virginity and youth renewed, but they will not be permitted to have more than one husband. Muhammad was 49 when his first wife Khadijah died. Shortly after, he betrothed a 6 or 7-year-old girl named Aisha. The marriage was consummated when she was 9 or 10. For this reason, prepubescent marriage is permitted under Sharia in some Muslim countries.
Compared to their treatment as mere property under Arab tribal custom and law, Muhammad probably elevated the respect and dignity of women in some ways. He also put a stop to the unspeakable practice of burying alive unwanted female infants. But some contend that Arab women had more power under the old system. They point out that Muhammad's first wife, Khadijah, was wealthy and powerful before she ever met Muhammad and became a Muslim. Aisha, Muhammad's favorite wife, known as the Mother of the Faithful, met with a woman who was beaten and bruised by her husband and remarked to Muhammad, "I have not seen any woman suffering as much as the believing women. Look, her skin is greener than her clothes." Muhammad did not rebuke the husband, but instead criticized the woman.
Muhammad also instituted temporary marriage, or muta, to satisfy his military men, many of whom had spent time away from their wives. Muta allows marriage to be contracted at a price for a short period and may have been based on prior Arabian custom. Critics regard it as a form of prostitution. Sunni Muslims abolished it shortly after Muhammad's time. However, Shia Muslims still allow it. According to news reports, the Islamic State, or ISIS, which is Sunni Muslim, has restored the ancient practice of muta by allowing its fighters to contract temporary marriages.
There is a certain disdain which women have endured under Islam. As the Quran and the Hadith abundantly testify, this emanated from the teachings and example of Muhammad himself. In his farewell address at the age of 62, Muhammad prescribed stoning for adultery and the use of corporal punishment to discipline wives. If isolation fails, Muhammad said, beat them with stripes, yet not severely. Women are also compared to property, captives, and prisoners by Muhammad. According to the Quran, a woman's testimony in court is worth half that of a man's. Under traditional Islamic law, which is based on the Quran, a victim of rape must produce 4 male witnesses in order to obtain justice against her assailant. Veiling the hair with a scarf, called a hijab, and wearing a full-length tunic is prescribed in the Quran. Veiling the face with the niqab or burqa is also required by law, according to most Muslim scholars.
An authoritative hadith from Muhammad's wife, Aisha, relates that when the Prophet instructed women to draw their veils over their bosoms, as is written in the Quran, they cut the edges of their waist sheets and covered both their heads and faces with the cut pieces of cloth.
FGM, female genital mutilation, considered a form of circumcision by Islam, was practiced with Muhammad's approval, according to tradition. In fact, it is required, according to some scholars. Women have little to look forward to in the afterlife. According to a reliable hadith, Muhammad had a vision of hell in which he saw that its inhabitants are mostly women. They are condemned for their lack of gratitude towards their husbands. Muhammad once remarked to a group of women that he had never seen anyone more deficient in intelligence and religion than women. Not all Muslims hold such a dim view of women, of course, but this is the teaching of traditional Islam.
Unlike Christianity, which was divided over the moral question of slavery throughout most of its history, Islamic doctrine and law fully embraced the sale and ownership of slaves from the beginning.
Slavery was an existing institution among the Arabs in Muhammad's time, as it was in many nations down through history. Islam perpetuated and regulated this practice under Sharia law until the 20th century. Some Muslim scholars still advocate slavery as an essential and integral practice of Islam.
The justification for slavery is based on the example of Muhammad himself. After defeating the Jews of the Banu Qurayza tribe when he was 57, Muhammad approved the slaughter of the adult males and enslaved or sold 1,000 women and girls, along with boys who had not reached puberty. The enslavement of conquered people became established practice throughout Islamic history and provided a continuous stream of labor, sex slaves, and revenue.
Under Sharia, any number of female captives could be retained as sex slaves, called concubines. If they're married, their marriages are annulled. Muhammad obtained 2 of his wives as captives of war and owned at least 2 concubines, in addition to several male slaves. Though he encouraged the kind treatment of slaves and the manumission of slaves, there is no penalty under Sharia law for a slave owner who rapes or kills his slave. Such laws were not always applied consistently, enabling slaves to fare much better in some places than in others.
Historically, Muslims created an extensive network of slave trade supplied by captives of war from all races, taken mostly from North Africa and Southern Europe. It is estimated that 10 to 18 million slaves were traded, including over 1 million Europeans, but no one knows the actual number. Slavery was not abolished in Saudi Arabia until the 1960s, but it still operates clandestinely in parts of the Muslim world today, and has recently been reinstituted by ISIS, the Islamic State. As Muslims struggle to define Islam in the modern world, Muhammad's complex character will continue to play a decisive role in shaping the future of this faith, with each faction seeking to justify its version of Islam from his teachings and example as found in the Quran and the traditions. Those who promote peace and human rights find their inspiration in Muhammad, as well as those who promote Sharia law, jihad, and even terrorism. Because these violent tendencies are patterned after the teachings and example of Muhammad himself, it is likely that they will always be an inseparable part of Islam.
Muhammad possessed the love, humility, and kindness of a saint, side by side with the viciousness, pretension, and cruelty of a tyrant. He was adored and loved by his followers, while being feared and despised by those who refused to accept his religion. This dualism in his character has been emulated by many of his adherents down through history, even to the present. It explains both the kindness we see among Muslims and the brutal attacks between Muslim sects and against those who stand in the way of Islamic rule.
The last scenes of Muhammad's life illustrate this contradiction. He cursed the Jews and Christians, calling for their destruction, while also taking care to leave a generous gift for the poor. Muhammad truly was, in many ways, an enigmatic religious leader.